Black Maid was sleeping in the trash. The billionaire froze. Where's the apartment? Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It is quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. The rain had started just after midnight, the kind that fell quietly over the city like a gray curtain. On the backside of the Whitmore Grand Hotel, where the bright lobby lights could not reach, a narrow service alley smelled faintly of damp cardboard and spilled coffee grounds. Metal dumpsters lined the brick wall, their lids rattling softly whenever the wind slipped between the tall buildings. Most nights the alley was empty except for the hum of the refrigeration units and the occasional rumble of a delivery truck. But tonight someone was there. Daniel Whitmore stepped out of the rear service door of the hotel, adjusting the collar of his coat as the cold air brushed against his face. At 48 years old, Daniel was known across the city as one of the wealthiest men in the state. His real estate company owned half the glass towers downtown, and his name was printed on charities, hospitals, and art museums. Yet at this hour of the night, he looked less like a billionaire and more like a tired father who had just left a late meeting. He had planned to walk the short distance to his car waiting across the service lot, but something made him stop. Near the far dumpster, beneath the dim yellow glow of a security light, there was movement. A shape shifted slowly between stacks of flattened boxes. At first Daniel thought it might be a stray animal searching for scraps. Then the shape lifted its head. It was a woman. She was wrapped in an old gray coat that looked several sizes too large for her. Pieces of cardboard had been arranged carefully on the ground to block the wet pavement, and a folded blanket rested beneath her head like a makeshift pillow. For a moment Daniel simply stared. The rain tapped softly against the metal lids of the dumpsters, echoing through the alley like distant footsteps. The woman did not seem to notice him yet. She was sleeping, her face turned slightly toward the light. There was something strangely familiar about her features, though Daniel could not immediately place why. A security guard stepped out behind Daniel and followed his gaze. The guard sighed quietly. "Sir, do not worry. She has been sleeping back here for a while. We usually ask her to move before the morning shift arrives." Daniel frowned slightly. "For a while?" The guard nodded. "Yes, sir. A few weeks at least. She keeps to herself. Never causes trouble." Daniel took a few slow steps closer, the wet pavement reflecting the dull glow of the alley light beneath his shoes. As he approached, the woman stirred. Her eyes opened slowly, adjusting to the brightness. When she sat up, brushing damp strands of hair from her face, Daniel felt a sudden tightness in his chest. He knew her, Naomi Brooks. She had worked in the hotel months earlier as part of the cleaning staff assigned to the upper floors. Daniel remembered her because his daughter Sophie had liked her immediately. Naomi had a calm voice that could settle a room, and Sophie had insisted that Naomi read bedtime stories whenever the family stayed at the penthouse suite during long work weeks. Naomi blinked when she recognized him. For a brief moment surprise crossed her face, but it quickly faded into the quiet politeness Daniel remembered well. "Good evening, sir," she said softly, her voice steady despite the cold air. "I am sorry if I am in the way." Daniel stopped a few feet from her makeshift bed of cardboard. The rain continued falling gently around them, carrying the faint smell of wet asphalt and coffee grounds through the alley. He looked down at the boxes, the blanket, the thin layer of cardboard protecting her from the pavement. Then he looked back at her. "Naomi," he said slowly, confusion deepening in his voice. "Why are you sleeping here?" Naomi lowered her eyes for a moment as the rain continued to tap softly against the metal dumpsters. She pulled the worn blanket tighter around her shoulders, as if the simple movement could hide the truth sitting right in front of Daniel Whitmore. "I did not want to cause trouble for the hotel," she said quietly. "I always leave before the morning staff arrives." Daniel studied her face under the dim security light. The same calm expression was there, the same quiet dignity he remembered from months ago when she used to work upstairs. But now there were dark circles under her eyes and a tiredness that had nothing to do with a late shift. The security guard shifted awkwardly behind Daniel. "Sir, like I said, she has been here for a while. She never makes a mess. Mostly just sleeps for a few hours and then disappears before sunrise." Daniel did not look at the guard. His eyes stayed on Naomi. A while, he repeated slowly. How long is a while? Naomi hesitated. The wind moved through the alley again, lifting a corner of the cardboard sheets beside her. It has been about 3 weeks, she finally said. I try to stay out of sight. Daniel felt something inside his chest tighten again. 3 weeks. Sleeping behind a hotel that carried his family name in glowing letters across the front of the building. That did not make sense. Naomi had always been one of the most reliable employees on the cleaning staff. Daniel remembered seeing her several times during late evenings when he walked Sophie back to the penthouse suite after dinner in the restaurant downstairs. Naomi had always greeted them politely, and Sophie would immediately run to her with a book clutched in both hands. Mr. Whitmore, Sophie would say, Miss Naomi reads the best stories. Daniel remembered the way Naomi used to kneel beside the sofa while Sophie climbed onto the cushions with her stuffed rabbit. Naomi never rushed those moments, even though she was technically working. She read slowly, changing her voice for every character, making Sophie laugh at the funny parts and relax during the quiet ones. The memory returned so clearly that Daniel almost expected to hear Sophie laughing somewhere above the alley. Instead, there was only the steady rhythm of rain. Naomi noticed the distant look in Daniel's eyes and seemed to understand what he was remembering. Sophie still likes the story about the brave little rabbit, she said softly. Daniel blinked slightly. You remember that? Naomi nodded. She asked for it almost every night. Daniel looked down at the cardboard sheets again, then back at Naomi. If you lost your job here, he said slowly, why did you not come to the front desk and ask for help? Naomi gave a small tired smile. Because the front desk has rules, sir. And rules are important in a place like this. Daniel frowned. What does that mean? It means I was not supposed to be here anymore, she replied gently. The guard looked confused. Wait a minute. You used to work here. Naomi nodded once. Yes. Housekeeping on the upper floors. Night shift. Daniel folded his arms slowly, his coat dark with rain. I know that part. What I do not understand is why someone who worked in this building is sleeping next to a dumpster behind it. Naomi did not answer right away. She glanced toward the service door, as if making sure no one else was listening. Then she spoke in a quiet voice that carried no anger, only exhaustion. Because sometimes losing a job means losing everything else too. Daniel felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the weather. What do you mean everything else? Naomi looked down at her hands resting on the blanket. When my mother got sick last winter, she explained slowly, I used my savings to help pay her medical bills. After she passed away, I did not have much left. When the hotel let me go last month, the apartment I was renting became impossible to afford. The landlord gave me 2 weeks. After that, there was nowhere else to go. The guard exhaled quietly. Man, that is rough. Daniel remained silent. The rain had grown slightly heavier now, running in thin streams down the brick wall beside the dumpsters. Naomi glanced at the sky and then back at Daniel. I know how this looks, she said. I promise I will move somewhere else if it causes problems for the hotel. Daniel stared at her in disbelief. Naomi, you are worried about causing problems for the hotel while you are sleeping in a pile of cardboard in the rain. Naomi shrugged gently. It is still your property, sir. And I respect that. Daniel looked away for a moment, toward the bright windows of the hotel rising above the alley. Inside those walls were marble floors, warm lights, and rooms that cost more for one night than most people earned in a week. Yet one of the women who had cleaned those rooms was now sleeping outside behind the building. When he looked back at Naomi, his voice had changed. It was quieter, but far more serious. Naomi, he said slowly, who told you that you had to leave your job here? Naomi hesitated when Daniel asked the question. The rain continued falling in a slow, steady rhythm that echoed softly through the narrow alley behind the hotel. For a few seconds, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigeration units and the distant rush of traffic from the main street half a block away. Naomi looked down at the cardboard beneath her hands as if studying the wet pavement through the thin layers protecting her from the cold ground. Finally, she spoke. The order came from the housekeeping manager, she said quietly. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Which manager? Naomi lifted her eyes carefully. Mr. Robert Klein. Daniel recognized the name immediately. Robert Klein had been the senior operations manager for the hotel for almost 5 years. He handled staffing decisions for the service departments and reported directly to the general manager. Robert Klein had always presented himself as efficient and loyal. At least that was the impression he had given during the few meetings Daniel had attended about the hotel operations. Daniel glanced briefly at the security guard who was still standing nearby with his hands in his coat pockets. The guard looked just as surprised as he did. Robert Klein fired you. Naomi shook her head slowly. Not exactly. Daniel frowned. Then explain it to me. Naomi shifted slightly on the cardboard, the thin blanket sliding from her shoulder before she pulled it back into place. He said my position was being reduced, she answered. He told me the hotel was restructuring the cleaning schedules and that my night shift position was no longer necessary. Daniel remained silent. Naomi continued carefully. He said if business improved the hotel might call me again later. The guard muttered under his breath. That sounds like a layoff. Naomi nodded once. Yes. Daniel stared at her for several seconds. Something about the explanation did not sit right with him. He had personally approved the hotel budget earlier that year, and there had been no discussion about cutting staff from the housekeeping department. In fact, the hotel had been running at nearly full occupancy during the spring season. Naomi noticed the doubt on his face. I did not argue, she added gently. I know the hotel has many employees. Sometimes changes happen. Daniel looked away toward the glowing windows above them. Somewhere up there guests were sleeping in warm rooms with clean sheets that had been folded by people like Naomi. The thought made the alley feel colder than it already was. When did this happen? Naomi answered without hesitation. 4 weeks ago. The guard blinked. 4 weeks. But you said you have been sleeping here for 3 weeks. Naomi gave a small, embarrassed smile. I stayed at a shelter for a few nights first. After that the beds filled up. Daniel felt another wave of disbelief move through him. You never tried to contact anyone from the hotel after that. Naomi shook her head again. No, sir. Why not? Because I was no longer part of the staff. Daniel exhaled slowly through his nose. Naomi, that building behind you has more than 200 rooms and dozens of employees. You helped clean those floors for almost 2 years. Someone there would have helped you. Naomi looked at him with a calm expression that carried no bitterness. Perhaps, she said softly, but I did not want to beg for something that belonged to someone else. Daniel did not answer immediately. The rain had grown heavier now, forming thin streams that ran along the cracks in the pavement toward the storm drain at the end of the alley. Naomi brushed a small drop of water from her sleeve. Besides, she added quietly, I thought it would only be temporary. Daniel looked at her sharply. Temporary? Yes. I believed I would find another job quickly. Daniel studied her face again. There was no anger there. No accusation. Only the quiet determination of someone who had been trying to survive day by day without complaining. That calmness somehow made the situation feel even worse. The guard shifted his weight again. Sir, if you want I can call the front desk and ask them to arrange a ride for her to a shelter tonight. Naomi immediately shook her head. That is not necessary. I will be fine. Daniel raised his hand slightly to stop the guard from reaching for his radio. Wait. The guard lowered his hand. Daniel turned back to Naomi. There is something I still do not understand. Naomi looked up at him. What is that? Daniel spoke slowly, choosing his words. Carefully. When Robert Klein told you your position was eliminated, did he say anything about the staff housing program? Naomi stared at him for a moment, as if she had not heard the question correctly. Staff housing program. Yes. Daniel nodded. The hotel maintains several apartments for employees who need temporary housing. It has existed for years. Naomi's expression changed slightly. A faint confusion appeared in her eyes. I do not know anything about that, she said quietly. Robert Klein never mentioned any apartment to me. Naomi remained silent for a moment after Daniel mentioned the staff housing program. The rain continued falling steadily, tapping against the metal dumpsters and dripping from the edges of the fire escape ladder above them. For several seconds, she simply stared at Daniel, as if the words had arrived from a world she had never been invited to see. A staff apartment, she repeated quietly. Daniel nodded slowly. Yes. The hotel keeps several small apartments a few blocks from here for employees who are going through difficult situations. Illness in the family. Temporary financial trouble. Situations exactly like yours. Naomi lowered her eyes again. I did not know that existed. The security guard looked from one of them to the other with growing confusion. Wait a minute, he said. I have worked here almost 2 years, and even I have heard about those apartments. Housekeeping staff talk about them sometimes. Naomi gave a small tired smile that carried no anger. No one ever mentioned them to me. Daniel felt a slow pressure building behind his ribs. When Robert Klein told you that your position was eliminated, he did not say anything about this program. Naomi shook her head. No, sir. He only said the hotel had no more space in the budget for night shift cleaners. Daniel folded his arms across his chest, the rain darkening the shoulders of his coat. Something about the explanation felt wrong in a way he could not ignore. The Whitmore Grand was one of the most profitable hotels in the entire city. Cutting a single housekeeping position would not have made any difference to the budget. Naomi noticed the change in Daniel's expression and spoke gently. Please do not misunderstand. Mr. Klein was always polite when he spoke with me. I believe he was simply doing his job. Daniel looked directly at her. Naomi, you are sleeping behind a dumpster in the rain. If someone made a decision that led to this situation, I need to understand exactly how it happened. Naomi hesitated again. The alley felt smaller now, the yellow security light casting long shadows across the wet pavement. When he told me my position was eliminated, she said slowly, he also asked if I had somewhere else to stay. Daniel waited. Naomi continued. I told him my lease would end soon because I could not pay the next month of rent. Daniel felt his jaw tighten slightly. And what did he say? Naomi looked down at her hands again. He said the hotel could not help with personal housing problems. The security guard muttered under his breath. That does not sound right at all. Daniel remained very still. Did he say those exact words? Naomi nodded. Yes, sir. Daniel turned his head toward the bright windows of the hotel rising above the alley. Inside those walls were people working night shifts at the front desk, preparing room service trays, folding fresh linens for the morning guests. All of it operating under policies that he had personally approved years earlier. Policies that included emergency staff housing for employees facing temporary hardship. Yet somehow Naomi had never been told about any of it. The rain ran down the brick wall beside them in thin streams that glistened under the security light. Daniel turned back to Naomi. After you left the shelter, why did you come here? Naomi answered without hesitation. Because it is quiet behind the hotel at night. And because I know the security lights stay on until sunrise. Daniel felt something in his chest tighten again. You came back to the place where you lost your job. Naomi nodded gently. It felt familiar. And I thought if anyone recognized me they might ask me to leave politely instead of calling the police. The guard shifted uncomfortably. I would not have done that. Naomi gave him a grateful look. Thank you. Daniel rubbed a hand slowly across his chin as the rain continued to fall. There was one more question forming in his mind, and the answer to it mattered more than anything else in that moment. Naomi, he said quietly, when Robert Klein told you that the hotel could not help with housing, did he also ask you to sign any paperwork before you left? Naomi looked up slowly when Daniel asked about paperwork. For a moment the rain seemed to grow louder in the narrow alley, tapping steadily against the metal lids and running in thin streams along the pavement. Yes, she said quietly. He asked me to sign a form before I left the building. Daniel did not move. What kind of form? Naomi took a breath and tried to remember the exact moment. The memory seemed to return piece by piece, like a photograph slowly developing in dim light. It was a release form, she explained. He said it confirmed that I was leaving the position voluntarily because of schedule changes. Daniel frowned. Voluntarily. Naomi nodded gently. That is what the document said. Daniel felt a sharp weight settle in his chest. Did you read it carefully before signing it? Naomi gave a small, embarrassed smile. I tried to. But the office was busy and he said it was only routine paperwork, so the payroll department could close my file. The security guard leaned forward slightly, clearly listening now with growing concern. Naomi continued in the same calm tone. I asked if it meant I could apply again later when the hotel needed more cleaners. He said yes, of course. He said it would keep my record clean so I could return one day. Daniel looked down at the wet pavement for a moment, processing every word she had said. When you signed the document, did he give you a copy? Naomi shook her head. No. He said the Human Resources office would keep it on file. Daniel slowly lifted his head again. The rain had begun running off the edge of his coat sleeves, but he did not seem to notice. Naomi, he said carefully, did he explain anything else about that document? Naomi hesitated, then nodded once. He said that because I signed the form, the hotel would not be responsible for unemployment benefits. The guard let out a quiet breath. That sounds like a resignation form. Naomi shrugged slightly. I did not think much about it at the time. I believed I would find another job within a week or two. Daniel felt something deep in his chest tighten again. Naomi, he said slowly, if that document listed your departure as voluntary, it would also prevent you from qualifying for several support programs that former employees can use during difficult periods. Naomi looked at him with a calm expression that held no blame. I understand that now, but at the time I trusted what he told me. Daniel stared at her for several seconds. She was not angry. She was not demanding anything. She was simply explaining what had happened as if the entire situation were an unfortunate misunderstanding rather than a chain of decisions that had left her sleeping behind a dumpster in the rain. The guard shifted again, clearly uncomfortable with what he was hearing. Sir, he said quietly, if someone tricked her into signing a resignation form, that is a serious problem. Daniel nodded slowly without taking his eyes off Naomi. Yes, it is. Naomi gently pulled the blanket closer around her shoulders as the rain continued to fall. Please do not cause trouble for anyone, she said softly. Mr. Klein may have simply misunderstood the situation. Daniel looked at her with disbelief. Naomi, you signed a document that removed your access to support programs, removed your access to unemployment assistance, and prevented you from qualifying for emergency housing that this hotel provides to staff in crisis. And now you are sleeping in a pile of cardboard behind the building that bears my family name. Naomi lowered her eyes again. I did not want to create problems for the hotel. Daniel was silent for a long moment. The sound of rain filled the space between them. Finally, he spoke again, his voice quieter but carrying a weight that had not been there before. Naomi, he said, there is something else I need to ask you. Naomi looked up. What is it? Daniel studied her face under the yellow security light. When you left that office 4 weeks ago, after signing the document Robert Klein gave you, did anyone else see you walking out of the building? Naomi looked toward the glowing windows of the hotel as Daniel finished speaking in the previous moment, and the memory he had just shared about Sophie still lingered quietly in the cold air between them. The rain had softened now into a light mist that drifted through the alley like thin gray smoke. For a few seconds Naomi did not say anything. Her eyes moved slowly from the pavement to the tall building behind Daniel. Somewhere high above them, warm lights still shined from the upper floors. Those floors had once been part of her nightly routine. She knew the scent of the polished hallways, the quiet hum of the elevators, the gentle rhythm of vacuum cleaners moving through the carpet long after guests had fallen asleep. Daniel noticed the distant look on her face. You are thinking about something, he said quietly. Naomi gave a small nod. I was remembering Sophie. Daniel felt a familiar tightening in his chest at the sound of his daughter's name. Naomi continued softly. She used to sit on the edge of the couch with her blanket wrapped around her shoulders while I read stories. She always held that stuffed rabbit with the loose ear. Daniel almost smiled despite the heavy moment. Mr. Whiskers. Naomi's tired eyes brightened slightly. Yes, that was the name. Daniel looked down for a moment. Sophie had carried that toy everywhere since she was very young. After her mother passed away 3 years earlier, the small rabbit had become something like a quiet companion that never left her side. Naomi's voice grew softer as she continued speaking. Sometimes Sophie did not want to sleep even after the story was finished. She would say the room felt too quiet. Daniel nodded slowly. I remember those nights. Naomi looked at him gently. I used to sit beside the sofa until she fell asleep. Daniel looked up again. Yes, I know. I saw you do that several times. Naomi lowered her gaze again toward the damp cardboard beneath her hands. The rain had nearly stopped now, leaving only the occasional drop sliding from the edge of the metal dumpster lid. After I left the hotel, she said quietly, I wondered if Sophie was sleeping well. Daniel felt the words settle heavily in the air. She has not been sleeping well, he admitted after a moment. Naomi looked up quickly. Is she all right? Daniel nodded slowly. She is healthy, but the nightmares came back after you left. Naomi's brow tightened with concern. Nightmares about the storm. Daniel nodded again. Yes. Ever since the accident that took her mother, loud rain sometimes wakes her during the night. Naomi looked toward the sky where the last light drops of rain were fading into the darkness. I used to sit by the window when storms came, she said softly. Sophie said the sound of someone turning the pages of a book helped her forget the thunder. Daniel felt another wave of quiet realization pass through him. The girl sleeping upstairs in the penthouse suite had found comfort in the voice of a woman who was now sleeping beside a dumpster in the alley below. The contrast felt impossible to ignore. Naomi brushed a damp strand of hair from her forehead. I am sorry I could not say goodbye to her properly when I left the hotel, she added gently. Daniel studied her face carefully. Naomi, you were worried about saying goodbye to my daughter while you were losing your home and your job at the same time. Naomi shrugged softly. Sophie deserved to understand why I disappeared. Daniel looked away toward the tall building again. Inside those walls was a child who still asked about the woman who used to read her stories at night. Down here in the alley was that same woman trying to stay warm beneath a thin blanket and a stack of cardboard. Daniel exhaled slowly. Naomi, he said after a long pause, do you know what Sophie asked me 2 nights ago before she went to sleep? Naomi shook her head. What did she ask? Daniel looked directly at her. She asked if Miss Naomi had moved to another hotel because she was too good for ours. Naomi remained very still after Daniel repeated the question Sophie had asked him. The faint mist in the alley had nearly faded, and the air felt colder now that the rain had stopped. For a few seconds Naomi did not speak. Her eyes moved slowly toward the tall glass windows above them, as if she could somehow see through the floors and walls to the quiet room where Sophie was probably sleeping. Too good for your hotel, Naomi repeated softly. Daniel nodded once. That was what she believed. Naomi gave a small, sad smile that carried both warmth and regret. Sophie always imagined the best about people. Daniel studied her expression carefully. That is true. Naomi pulled the thin blanket a little tighter around her shoulders as the cool night air settled into the alley. I never told her stories about being poor, she said quietly. Daniel tilted his head slightly. What do you mean? Naomi looked down at the cardboard sheets beneath her again. When I read stories to children, I try to leave out the parts that make the world feel smaller. Daniel listened closely. Naomi continued in a calm, thoughtful voice. Some children grow up hearing too many things that make them afraid. Afraid of losing people. Afraid of storms. Afraid of tomorrow. I did not want Sophie to think the world was a place where good people simply disappear. Daniel felt the words settle deep inside his chest. Naomi brushed a small drop of water from the sleeve of her coat. So I told her stories where brave rabbits always found their way home and storms always ended before morning. Daniel looked at the ground for a moment, absorbing what she had said. The quiet sincerity in her voice carried more weight than any accusation could have. You were protecting her sense of safety, he said slowly. Naomi nodded gently. Children deserve to believe the world will take care of them. Daniel lifted his eyes again toward the towering hotel behind them. And yet here you are, he said quietly. Naomi followed his gaze up the building for a moment before answering. Life does not always match the stories we tell children. Daniel noticed that she had said it without bitterness. There was no anger in her voice. Only a quiet understanding that seemed far older than the moment they were standing in. The security guard had stepped back toward the service door to give them space, but he was still watching from a distance with a concerned expression. Daniel took a slow breath. Naomi, he said carefully, Sophie has asked about you almost every week since you left. Naomi's eyes softened slightly. She did. Yes. Daniel nodded. At first I told her you had taken another job in a different building. Naomi smiled faintly. That sounds kinder than the truth. Daniel gave a small tired laugh. I thought so too. Naomi looked down again for a moment before speaking. I hope she did not feel abandoned. Daniel answered immediately. She did not. She believed you were helping other children somewhere else. Naomi let out a quiet breath that almost sounded like relief. That is good. Daniel watched her closely. Naomi, you have spent the last 3 weeks sleeping outside in the cold, yet the first thing you worry about is whether a little girl upstairs felt abandoned. Naomi shrugged gently. Sophie trusted me. Daniel said nothing for several seconds. The night had grown very quiet now that the rain was gone. Somewhere down the block a distant car door closed, and the faint echo of the sound drifted through the alley. Finally Daniel spoke again. Naomi, if Sophie saw you here right now, what do you think she would say? Naomi looked up at him with a thoughtful expression. She would probably ask why I am not wearing a coat thick enough for the weather. Daniel almost smiled again. That sounds exactly like her. Naomi's voice grew softer. Then she would probably ask if I am cold. Daniel nodded slowly. And what would you tell her? Naomi glanced down at the blanket and cardboard beneath her. I would tell her the same thing I told her during storms. Daniel leaned forward slightly. Which was? Naomi looked back at him with the same calm kindness she had always shown. I would tell her that everything is going to be all right, even if the night feels long. Daniel did not answer immediately after Naomi finished speaking. The quiet certainty in her voice lingered in the cold air of the alley like the final note of a song that refused to fade. Everything is going to be all right, even if the night feels long. The words were simple, yet Daniel felt them settle heavily in his chest. He looked at Naomi sitting on the flattened cardboard beside the dumpster, and suddenly the entire scene felt unreal. Inside the building behind them were marble floors, soft carpets, and suites that cost more for one night than many families spent on groceries for a month. Yet one of the kindest people his daughter had ever known was sleeping outside in the damp shadows of that same building. Daniel slowly ran a hand across his face as he thought about the last few weeks. Sophie asking about Naomi. Sophie refusing to sleep until he read the story of the brave rabbit. Sophie staring at the empty corner of the sofa where Naomi used to sit and turn the pages of a book during storms. The realization arrived quietly but powerfully. Naomi had not only been a housekeeper in his hotel, she had been part of the fragile sense of safety his daughter depended on every night. Daniel lifted his eyes again. Naomi, he said softly, do you know something strange? Naomi looked up at him with gentle curiosity. What is that? Daniel gave a quiet breath. For the past month, I believed you had simply moved on to another job. I thought you had chosen to leave. Naomi nodded slightly. That would have been easier for everyone. Daniel shook his head slowly. But now I realize something. Naomi waited. Daniel spoke with careful honesty. My daughter trusted you more than almost anyone in this building. Naomi looked surprised by that statement. She trusted you because you were kind when you did not have to be. You read stories even after your shift ended. You stayed during storms even though it was not your responsibility. Daniel paused briefly before continuing. And while you were doing those things for my family, the system inside my own hotel was quietly pushing you out the door. Naomi listened without interrupting. Daniel looked down at the damp pavement for a moment. I built that system, he said quietly. Naomi immediately shook her head. You cannot blame yourself for every decision made by managers. Daniel lifted his gaze again. Perhaps not every decision, but I am responsible for what happens inside my buildings. Naomi remained silent. The security guard shifted near the service door, listening but keeping his distance. Daniel studied Naomi carefully. Her coat was thin. Her blanket looked like it had once been part of an old bedding set that had long since worn out. The cardboard beneath her had softened from the rain. She had arranged everything carefully to stay dry, but it was still nothing more than a fragile barrier between her and the cold pavement. Naomi noticed his expression and tried to lighten the moment slightly. It is not as uncomfortable as it looks, she said gently. Daniel let out a small breath that almost sounded like disbelief. Naomi, you are sitting beside a trash container in the middle of the night in early spring weather. You should not have to convince anyone that it is acceptable. Naomi gave a quiet shrug. Sometimes survival requires a little imagination. Daniel looked toward the hotel again. Somewhere up there Sophie was sleeping beneath warm blankets in a quiet room. The contrast between the two realities felt impossible to ignore any longer. Daniel turned back to Naomi with a new seriousness in his voice. Naomi, I need to ask you something important. Naomi tilted her head slightly. What is it? Daniel spoke slowly. If someone offered you a safe place to sleep tonight, would you accept it? Naomi hesitated. The question seemed to catch her off guard. A safe place, she repeated softly. Yes, Daniel said. A warm bed. A roof. Somewhere you do not have to worry about the rain. Naomi looked down at the cardboard again for several seconds. When she finally looked up, there was uncertainty in her eyes. That sounds kind, she said carefully. But I do not want charity. Daniel shook his head immediately. I am not offering charity. Naomi studied him with curiosity. Then what are you offering? Daniel held her gaze. I am offering a correction to a mistake that never should have happened. Naomi looked at Daniel carefully after he said he was offering a correction instead of charity. The words hung in the quiet alley for a moment while the last drops of water slid from the metal dumpster lids and landed softly on the pavement. A correction, she repeated slowly. Daniel nodded. Yes. Naomi studied his face as if trying to understand what he truly meant. You were talking about the staff apartments you mentioned earlier. Daniel gave a small breath. Exactly. Naomi lowered her eyes again. Mr. Klein told me there were no programs like that available. Daniel felt a calm but firm determination settle inside his voice. Then Mr. Klein was either misinformed or dishonest. Naomi immediately shook her head gently. Please do not assume the worst about him. Daniel looked at her with quiet disbelief. Naomi, he said slowly, you were removed from your position under circumstances that do not match any policy inside this hotel. You were asked to sign paperwork that removed your access to support programs. And you were never told about the housing assistance that exists specifically for employees in your situation. Naomi did not respond right away. The silence between them was not defensive. It was simply thoughtful. Finally, she spoke again in a calm voice. Even if that is true, she said, the hotel still has rules. Daniel nodded once. Yes, it does. Naomi lifted her eyes to meet his again. And I signed a document saying I left voluntarily. Daniel took a slow breath. That document may exist, but it does not erase the reality of what happened. Naomi seemed unsure how to answer that. Daniel continued carefully. Naomi, the housing program exists because situations like yours happen more often than people realize. Illness in a family, unexpected expenses, temporary job changes. The program was created so employees would never have to face those moments alone. Naomi listened quietly. Daniel gestured toward the tall building behind them. That building employs hundreds of people. Some of them clean rooms. Some cook meals. Some manage reservations. But every person working inside that building deserves dignity. Naomi gave a small nod. I believe that too. Daniel took another breath before speaking again. Then you should also believe that sleeping beside a dumpster in the rain is not the dignity you deserve. Naomi looked down at the damp cardboard again. I never expected dignity to come easily, she said softly. Daniel responded gently but firmly. It should not require sleeping outside either. Naomi seemed to consider that carefully. The security guard near the service door shifted again, clearly following every word of the conversation. Daniel stepped a little closer to Naomi. There are 3 employee apartments maintained by the hotel, less than 4 blocks from here, he explained. They are small but clean, fully furnished, designed for temporary stays until people regain their footing. Naomi looked surprised again. 3 apartments. Daniel nodded. One of them has been empty for nearly 2 months. Naomi blinked slowly. Why has no one used it? Daniel answered honestly. Because the people who need it are often too proud to ask. Naomi gave a faint, thoughtful smile at that. That sounds familiar. Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his coat and pulled out his phone. Naomi watched with quiet curiosity. Daniel dialed a number and waited while the call connected. The line picked up after a moment. A tired voice answered from the other end. Front desk. Daniel spoke calmly but clearly. This is Daniel Whitmore. I need the manager on duty immediately. There was a brief silence on the line before the voice responded with sudden alertness. Yes, sir. One moment, please. Naomi watched him carefully while he waited. You are going to wake someone in the middle of the night because of me? She said quietly. Daniel looked at her and answered in a calm voice. Naomi, people have been waking up in the middle of the night to read stories to my daughter for years. The least I can do is wake up my own staff when something important needs to be fixed. The line clicked again as another voice came on. Mr. Whitmore, this is Angela Morris, the night manager. How may I help you? Daniel did not hesitate. Angela, he said, I want you to check the status of the employee housing apartment on Pine Street. Then I want you to tell me why it has been sitting empty while a former member of our staff has been sleeping in the alley behind this building. Angela Morris did not answer immediately after Daniel finished speaking. On the other end of the phone, the faint background noise of the hotel lobby could be heard, the soft hum of computers, and the distant sound of an elevator opening somewhere down the hallway. Naomi sat quietly on the cardboard, watching Daniel with a mixture of concern and curiosity. Finally, Angela spoke. Sir, the apartment on Pine Street is listed as reserved in the housing system. Daniel's eyes narrowed slightly. Reserved. Yes, sir. The file says it was assigned nearly 1 month ago. Daniel felt a slow chill move through his chest. Assigned to whom? There was another pause as Angela checked the computer. Naomi could hear the faint tapping of keys through the phone speaker. Then Angela spoke again, her voice more uncertain now. According to the record, it was assigned to a housekeeping employee named Naomi Brooks. Naomi blinked in surprise and looked at Daniel. Daniel did not move. Angela, he said calmly, the person you just named is sitting in front of me right now in the service alley behind the hotel. She has been sleeping outside for 3 weeks. The silence that followed was longer this time. When Angela finally spoke again, her voice carried clear shock. That cannot be correct. The apartment was marked as occupied. Daniel's voice remained steady but firm. Angela, listen carefully. Naomi Brooks never received access to that apartment. She was never given keys. She was never told the apartment existed. Angela inhaled sharply on the other end of the line. Sir, if the system shows the unit as occupied, then someone must have processed the assignment. Daniel already knew the answer before he asked the next question. Who authorized the assignment in the system? Angela checked the record again. The entry was created by the operations manager, Robert Klein. Naomi lowered her eyes again when she heard the name. Daniel felt the truth settle heavily in his mind. The apartment had been officially assigned to Naomi in the records, which meant that on paper the hotel had already fulfilled its obligation to help her. But in reality, Naomi had never even known the apartment existed. Daniel spoke slowly. Angela, I want you to open the security access records for the Pine Street apartment building. There was a brief pause while Angela searched the files. Then she spoke again. Sir, according to the electronic lock system, the apartment has been accessed regularly for the past 4 weeks. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. Accessed by whom? The system shows a key card belonging to Robert Klein. Naomi looked up slowly at Daniel, confusion and quiet disbelief in her eyes. Daniel did not look at her yet. Angela continued reading from the screen. The records show that Mr. Klein has entered the apartment building multiple times during the past month. Daniel spoke in a calm voice that now carried unmistakable authority. Angela, I want you to wake the general manager immediately. Then I want you to pull every document connected to Naomi Brooks and the Pine Street apartment. Do not change anything in the system. Do you understand? Yes, sir, Angela replied quickly. Daniel ended the call and slowly lowered the phone. The alley was completely quiet again. Naomi sat very still as she tried to process what had just been revealed. After a few seconds, she spoke softly. He told me the hotel could not help. Daniel finally looked directly at her. Naomi, the hotel did help. The apartment was assigned to you weeks ago. Naomi shook her head slightly, as if the idea still felt impossible. Then why did he keep the keys? Daniel answered with quiet clarity. Because as long as the system showed the apartment was occupied, no one would question why it was unavailable. Naomi stared at the ground again. The thin cardboard beneath her hands suddenly seemed even more fragile than before. Daniel looked at her carefully. Naomi, he said softly, the apartment on Pine Street was meant to be your safe place. And tonight that mistake is going to be corrected. The alley felt different after the truth came out. The quiet was heavier now, as if the night itself understood what had just been uncovered. Naomi sat motionless for a few seconds, absorbing the words Daniel had spoken. The apartment had been hers all along. It had existed only a few blocks away, warm and ready, while she had been sleeping beside cold concrete and damp cardboard. Naomi slowly lifted her eyes toward Daniel. I did not know, she said softly. Daniel nodded gently. I know. Naomi looked toward the tall hotel building again. The lights from the upper floors reflected faintly in the wet pavement. For a moment she seemed lost in thought. Then she spoke again. Mr. Klein told me the hotel could not help. Daniel's voice remained calm but firm. The hotel did help. Someone simply made sure you never received it. Naomi lowered her gaze again. The realization did not seem to bring anger to her face. Instead it brought something quieter, something closer to sadness. Daniel studied her carefully. Naomi, he said, you have every reason to be upset right now. Naomi shook her head slowly. Anger will not warm the night, she replied. Daniel was silent for a moment. The security guard near the door looked away respectfully, giving them space as the conversation continued. Naomi gently folded the thin blanket across her lap. If the apartment was truly meant for me, she said quietly, then someone else must have needed it more. Daniel looked at her with disbelief. Naomi, someone has been using a place that was never theirs. That is not kindness. That is deception. Naomi gave a small thoughtful nod, but did not argue. Daniel stepped a little closer to where she sat. The cold air moved through the alley again, but this time Naomi did not seem to notice it. Instead, she asked a simple question. What will happen now? Daniel answered immediately. The apartment will be open tonight. Naomi blinked. Tonight? Yes. Daniel nodded. The general manager will arrive soon. The locks will be reset. The apartment will be prepared for the person it was originally assigned to. Naomi looked uncertain again. I do not want anyone else to lose their place because of me. Daniel spoke gently, but with quiet authority. Naomi, the place was never theirs to begin with. Naomi considered that in silence. The security guard finally stepped forward again. "Miss Brooks," he said respectfully, "if you are moving into that apartment tonight, I would be happy to help carry your things." Naomi looked around the alley at the small collection of belongings beside her. A folded blanket, a worn backpack, a pair of shoes tucked carefully beneath the cardboard. She gave a faint smile. "It will not take much carrying." Daniel felt another quiet weight in his chest at those words. A life reduced to a few simple items resting beside a dumpster. Naomi slowly stood up from the cardboard. Her legs were slightly stiff from the cold ground, but she straightened her coat and looked toward the hotel building again. Somewhere above them, Sophie was sleeping peacefully, unaware that the woman who once read her bedtime stories was standing in the alley below. Naomi turned back to Daniel. "Thank you for fixing the mistake," she said softly. Daniel shook his head gently. "Naomi, this is not kindness. This is accountability." Naomi gave a small, thoughtful nod. Sometimes those two things look very similar. In the distance, the soft sound of a car turning into the service driveway echoed between the buildings. Headlights briefly illuminated the alley before the vehicle slowed to a stop near the rear entrance of the hotel. The security guard looked toward the driveway. "That will be the general manager," he said quietly. Daniel nodded once. Naomi followed the movement of the lights with her eyes. The night that had felt endless only an hour earlier was finally beginning to change. And somewhere only a few blocks away, an apartment that had been waiting for weeks was about to open its door for the person it had always belonged to. The headlights from the arriving car slowly faded as the engine turned off near the rear entrance of the hotel. The night manager stepped out first, followed closely by the general manager, a tall man named Patrick Lawson, who looked both concerned and fully awake despite the late hour. Patrick walked quickly toward Daniel, adjusting his coat as the cool night air moved through the alley. "Daniel, I came as soon as I received the call," Patrick said. Daniel nodded and gestured toward Naomi. Patrick followed the motion of his hand and immediately recognized her face. "Miss Brooks," he said quietly, his expression shifting to one of clear concern. Naomi gave a small polite nod. "Good evening, sir." Patrick looked from Naomi to Daniel and then toward the cardboard on the ground beside the dumpster. The situation became clear without another word. Daniel spoke calmly. "Patrick, the apartment on Pine Street that was assigned to Naomi Brooks has been occupied under false access records for the past 4 weeks." Patrick's expression hardened slightly as he processed the information. "I have already reviewed the preliminary report," he said. "The electronic access logs confirm everything Angela told you." Daniel nodded. "And Robert Klein?" Patrick gave a single firm nod. "He has been suspended from his position effective immediately. There will be a full investigation in the morning." Naomi listened quietly without interrupting. Patrick then turned his full attention to her. "Miss Brooks," he said with sincere respect, "the apartment assigned to you has been inspected and prepared. A new electronic key has already been issued." Naomi seemed unsure how to respond at first. "You mean tonight?" Patrick nodded. "Yes, tonight. The unit is warm and fully furnished. Fresh linens have been placed on the bed, and the refrigerator has been stocked with basic groceries." Naomi lowered her eyes briefly, as if steadying herself. "Thank you," she said softly. Daniel watched her carefully. The moment felt quiet but important. Naomi then glanced toward the cardboard where she had been sitting only minutes earlier. The security guard stepped forward and picked up her backpack and blanket with gentle care. He gave her a friendly smile. "I think these will look a lot better inside an apartment than beside a dumpster." Naomi smiled faintly in return. "I think you might be right." Patrick gestured toward the car waiting near the service entrance. "We will drive you there now. It is less than a 10-minute ride." Naomi took one last look at the alley before walking toward the car. The damp pavement still reflected the security light above the dumpsters, but the place already felt like something she was leaving behind. Daniel walked beside her as they reached the car door. Naomi paused before getting inside and looked at him with quiet gratitude. "You fixed more than a mistake tonight," she said. Daniel shook his head gently. "Naomi, you did something far more important long before tonight." Naomi tilted her head slightly. "What do you mean?" Daniel answered with a calm sincerity that carried no hesitation. "You helped my daughter feel safe when the world felt frightening. You gave her kindness without expecting anything in return." Naomi looked down for a moment before answering softly. "Children deserve that much." Daniel nodded. "Yes, they do." Naomi, then stepped into the car, and the door closed gently behind her. A few minutes later, the vehicle pulled away from the alley and disappeared around the corner toward Pine Street. Daniel remained standing there for a moment longer. The cardboard on the ground had already been cleared away. The alley looked empty again, but it no longer felt the same. Somewhere only a few blocks away, a light would soon turn on inside a small apartment that had been waiting quietly for its rightful occupant. And upstairs in the hotel, a little girl who believed that good people always find their way home was finally going to be right.